Well, welcome back to the Faith Roots podcast, and we're continuing our series looking at the question, how do you know? How do we know truth? And how do we distinguish truth from lies? It's really the start of what we might call a systematic theology, an introduction to doctrine, the key things that we believe. And as we saw last week, when we think about the questions of belief, we're thinking about four big questions. We're thinking about who is God and what is he like. And we saw last week that we can choose to believe either truth or lies about God. And then there's the question, what is creation? And what is it like? Is creation good and ordered? Is it created, or has it emerged, evolved by chance? That includes questions about why, if there is a good God who made a good world, why do we see suffering, sickness, disease, death in the world? We want to answer those types of questions, and so we get into not just creation, but the doctrine of the fall and the doctrine of sin. And of course, key to that is an understanding of who I am, who we are, what it means to be human. What are we like? What does it mean to say that we are made in God's image, but also that we are fallen because of sin? And we want to answer questions about the future, about life beyond this world, about new creation, about heaven, about life after death, about Christ's return, and what those future days and that future world, that future new creation will be like. And so those are some of the questions that we will cover later on in podcasts in depth. This is going to be proper serious stuff, because our aim is to help train and equip people to think through these things, to be equipped for gospel ministry, particularly in urban settings, but not exclusively, and to make accessible to the wider church theological thinking, theological study, to help you with that. So today we're continuing to think about how do we know, how do you and I know truth about God, creation, humanity, and new creation. And last week we saw that when we think about this thing called systematic theology or doctrine, that this is something that is helpful for the messy, chaotic, disordered, suffering world that we live in. Essential to helping Christians live godly lives together as part of the church in this world. And that's because we're starting to think about how we know truth, how we know the things that we need to know to live. You remember from last week that we saw that what we believe, what we think, what we know affects how we feel and how we behave. It can even affect us physically. And so belief is important. And so we want to really understand, where do we get our beliefs from, and what beliefs can we trust? How do we know whether or not the things that we believe are reliable and true and trustworthy? See how people have answered that question. How do you know? We're going to see really that there are two main options. And the first option is really this, that we know through what we are able to discover and find out for ourselves. So I want to suggest that throughout history, there's been a kind of swing between two views of our ability to know and to reason and to think for ourselves. Those are rationalism and irrationalism. And you'll see there I've got a couple of definitions up on the screen. Rationalism involves presenting confidence in human ability to reason things out using the intellect, and it involves the ability to discover objective truth. So rationalism is about confidence in the human ability to reason things out using the intellect and so discover objective truth. The emphasis there is on facts, on knowledge, and theories. And the big question is it true? And throughout history, you have seen, particularly through philosophy, particularly through science, a great level of confidence. That's why we have intellectualism. That's why we have universities. That's why we have science and philosophy as big subjects of people to study. The belief that I, through my mind, can discover and can reason and can know. But you might have caught a glimpse, if you're watching, of a slide that I had up prior to that I have called the pendulum of rationality. The pendulum of rationality. That there's been this swing between rationalism and irrationalism, like a pendulum on a clock, if you remember those old clocks, swinging backwards and forwards from one to the other. So at different points in history, you'll see that there is a high level of confidence in our ability to reason and to think and to know. But that confidence isn't always consistent. Instead, what we see is that at different times the pendulum swings from rationalism, the belief, that overconfidence, if you like, in our ability to process, to deduce, to work out for ourselves truth, and swinging then to that irrationality, that belief that actually the world doesn't make sense, we are not able to reason it out, and we don't have the capacity to work out truth for ourselves. And so if we have rationalism at the one end of the pendulum, at the other end is this irrationalism. So going back there, irrationalism is characterized by pessimism at human ability to reason things out and discover objective truth. The emphasis then becomes much more about experience and feelings. Does it feel good? Does it work? And specifically, does it work for me? And so rationalism answers the question, is it true? Whereas irrationalism says, I can't really answer that question. I don't know if this is true, but I can tell you if the experience is good. I can tell you if it works for me. And so you might see a greater level of pragmatism there. And over time through history, we've seen that pendulum swinging backwards and forwards. So, on the one hand, you had rationalists, philosophers, going right back to Plato and Descartes, and they would argue, Plato, great philosopher, Socrates, Aristotle, they're all arguing that you can know and discover truth for yourself. That human reason is autonomous, that we don't need any outside inputs. In fact, Descartes started from the point that I can't be certain of the truth, the reality of the world around me, of everything that I think and see and perceive. So what I have to do is go right back to basics, to the fact that I think, that I do have a mind that is processing. I think, therefore I am. What that means is that a rationalist will talk about a priori concepts, truths that are self-evident. Truth then is known through innate knowledge and deduction. So Descartes, on the one hand, saying all I really can trust is my mind, the fact that I think, and that's where I go back to start to process truth and reality. I rely on my ability to think and to know, and from there start to make observations outward. But that confidence hasn't always been there. So still kind of slightly on the rationalist end of the pendulum, but starting to move away from that confidence in autonomous human reason is empiricism. Empiricists said, no, all that you can really be certain of is what you can observe, what you can see, what you can hear, what you can touch and feel, what you can measure. This is an approach historically associated with philosophers like David Hume, and in contemporary terms, it's people like the New Atheists, Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, Christopher Hitchens, arguing that all we can really know is what we can see and observe, what we can analyze in the science lab. And if we cannot see it, if we cannot touch it, if we cannot feel it, if we cannot hear it, if we cannot measure it, if we cannot observe it, if we cannot experiment with it, then we cannot know it, we cannot be certain about it. And in fact, some of these people go so far as to say that if it isn't observable, isn't touchable, hearable, seeable, measurable, then it doesn't exist. The reality is only the things that we can observe. Empiricists, therefore, rule out the possibility of a God, of anything supernatural, and anything that we might consider to be to do with faith. Now, the problem is that the pendulum swings further. That pendulum of rationality swings further beyond empiricism into rationalism. And one of the things that we have seen throughout history is that there is this backwards and forwards, this reaction to. And so going back in history, you've got these philosophers that are arguing that, yes, we can process things with our mind, we can reason things out, we can deduce things, that truth is self-evident as per the US Constitution. We hold these things to be self-evident. And then there are others saying, no, we can't even trust our minds. All we can really say for certain is what we can see around us, what we can think, what we can know, what we can observe. And then other people started to say, can you be really sure about that? Can you be really sure even about the things that you are observing? And that's partly because of a lack of confidence in our ability to trust our senses in that way. Also because of that feeling that empiricism is so bleak, so cold, because it leaves us with very little, that there is nothing beyond the immediate observations. And it takes away the place of feelings and emotions, it takes away the place of faith. And so we get a response to that called romanticism. Romanticism is a major response to empiricism. And it's an approach that has had a huge influence, particularly on the arts, on literature, on poetry, on painting, and on drawing. Romanticism is that belief that whilst we may not be able to know truth for certain by what we observe, that actually the world around us doesn't tell us that much about things like love or justice or hope. Like romanticism says that if we can't reason it out and we can't observe it out, we can at least feel it. And so romanticism places the emphasis on aesthetic qualities, on beauty, on passions or feelings such as love. And so, in a sense, what romanticism says is that we are going to reach around the world that we observe and go beyond it, that where our eyes and our ears and our touch cannot take us through to the transcendent, we will find a way through. If not by knowledge, not by intellect, not by observation, we will find our way through our experience and our emotions. And this is particularly associated with philosophers like Rousseau and Swedenborg and Blake, but also the poets Coleridge and Wordsworth and people like that. Now, the pendulum keeps swinging backwards and forwards. So what you see is that there's a period called the Enlightenment, going back a few centuries, when there's this big emphasis on rationalism, on reason, that leads into empiricism. But then you've got that counter-reaction of romanticism. And then there's this swing back that really attempts like Marxism, the big 20th century modernist projects, are attempts either through reason, through philosophy and ideology, or through empiricism, through observation and pragmatism, to make sense of the world around us and to make sense of who we are. And those attempts are seen in the big movements of the 20th century. Communism and capitalism, in effect. I would suggest that then that if you look at it fairly closely, that fascism and National Socialism, the Nazis are in effect what we might refer to as a romantic movement, a reaction to that rationalism. For alienated people to create a myth of a super race. The heroes being Hitler and the Aryan master race, against the threat of an enemy, the heroes and villains. And the enemy in this romantic story, of course, brutally and sadly, were the Jews. And that romanticism can edge into, that irrationalism can edge into any political ideology. That's why we see anti-Semitism. It's also why we see other conspiracy theories that set apart a particular group, a class, a gender, a race, perceive them as a threat, as a danger, as those that are conspiring against us. So the 20th century, moving into the 21st century, sees that pendulum continuing to swing backwards and forwards, this battle of ideas. Are we able to know truth for certain? Are we able to observe? Are we able to reason and deduce? Or is that impossible? Must we give up on the possibility of a rational, ordered, predictable, knowable universe, and the possibility that we are ordered, predictable, knowable, and instead rely on our emotions and our experience just to, in effect, get on with the ride? And of course, that's where postmodernism as a reaction to modernism comes in. That really is when we see philosophers and artists and literature giving up on the possibility of objective truth. So we associate modernism with technology, industrialization, and communism and capitalism. Postmodernism is a reaction that says those things have failed. They've failed to bring lasting peace and prosperity. And so postmodernism is the take, sometimes also referred to as philosophical pluralism, that there isn't a single certain objective truth that we can know definitely. Instead, you and I, each of us, have our own personal truth, what we believe and hold true for ourselves. And you hear people increasingly talking about it, don't you? So Prince Harry has written a book, Spare, where he describes his life as a member of the royal family, and then what led through his marriage to Meghan Markle to his alienation from the royal family. And you may remember that the Queen, in reference to earlier claims, said that memories and recollections may vary. And so Prince Harry makes big claims. I'm not going to go into the detail, the tittle-tattle of the book, but he makes big claims about his experience in the Afghan war, his experience of his relationship to his father, to his grandparents, to his brother, to his sister-in-law. And some of those claims have been disputed, not just whether or not they're a fair reflection on the family members, but even whether or not Harry has managed to get some of the historical facts correct. That things are claimed in the book that, when you look back at the history, aren't actually possible or true, that people were in different places or different things were happening. But of course, Harry's reaction, I understand, is preempted in the book, is to say, I'm not claiming that my recollections are objectively accurate, but this is my truth. This is my recollection. And so to question my truth, my recollection, my memory, my experience, my feelings is not allowed. In fact, in this postmodern world, it is even seen as abusive to challenge the truth of others. You can't step in and impose your truth on me. Because when you step in and claim, no, this is objectively what happened, you're making a claim you can't make, because no one knows what objectively happened. So all you are doing when you say, I disagree with you, that didn't happen, is you're saying, I have a different truth. And then there's a question there about if my truth conflicts with your truth, and you've got him first and told your truth, am I actually permitted to tell mine? Is postmodernism, is pluralism really about equally accepted relative truths, or is it about competing claims? And if so, who wins out? Now I want to make some comments here from a Christian perspective on that history, that competition to determine how we know. And you may not be surprised to know that I think there are problems with all of these. You see, what all of these positions are doing is they are seeking to make you and me, to make humans autonomous. And when we seek to act autonomously, independent, sometimes from each other, but primarily autonomous from God, then we find ourselves back in Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, the temptation for Adam and Eve was, you do not need God. That if you eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then you are no longer dependent on God for truth, because you can know that truth for yourself. And you will notice that the temptation and the thinking in Genesis 3 is both rational. It appeals to their mind, their ability to know and work things out for themselves. And it has that empiricist element, doesn't it? That Eve makes a decision based on the look and the appeal of the fruit and the benefit of the fruit, the potential taste of it. But at the same time, it's also irrational. It's rational because they reason it out. But it's irrational because by making that decision to be autonomous, they reject everything that they've known and experienced and been able to reason so far. That their knowledge so far is that God is good, that God provides, and that yes, they are dependent on him. The irrationalism of being told you can be like God when they are already made in God's image. And so because both rationalism and irrationalism are a product of the fall, product of our selfish desire to live life for ourselves without God, and to be independent, autonomous from him, in the end they're both doomed to fail. I think that's most obviously seen in the chaotic, hopeless mess of postmodernism. The uncertainty, the bewildering, chaotic world that it leaves. That sense that even if I'm getting good feelings, good experiences, that if they're not anchored in anything true and certain, then they're temporary and fleeting and leave a bitter aftertaste. As a Christian, I want to categorically reject postmodernism. I want to highlight the dangers, the problems with earlier romanticism because of the way it leads. Oh, well, we've seen where it leads. It leads to fascism. It leads to the Holocaust. It leads to, as we're seeing with the royal family, it leads to broken relationships, wrecked families, hurting people. where nobody wins, where nobody really benefits. But I also want to affirm the critique of the irrationalist, that we cannot know things for certain, that we cannot reason things out for ourselves, because that makes me the ultimate authority for everything. But my mind is finite, it's limited, it cannot process and comprehend everything exhaustively and certainly. And then if we factor in the fall, if we factor in sin, that my mind is both finite and fallen. So no, I cannot depend on my reason. And what we see in Genesis 3 is that when humans seek to live life autonomous from God, it ends in shame, it ends in guilt, and it ends in judgment, and it ends in death. So I want to suggest that there is a better alternative, a different answer. The Bible takes us to a different answer, found in these words from Romans 1, verse 16 to 17. Romans 1 says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed. In the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed. And what Romans 1 says is that we try to live lives for ourselves. We try to reject God, but we need God, and we need something called revelation. That we are dependent on God to show us. I cannot reason it out for myself. I cannot observe it for myself. I cannot feel it for myself. I need God to tell me and God to show me truth. That if I am going to get the answers that I need to those questions about God, creation, humanity, and new creation, then I need to ask God. And in future weeks, we're going to be finding out how it is that God reveals truth to us, so that we can trust him and distinguish truth from lies, so that we can find hope and peace in this messy and chaotic and uncertain world.